There we go. Oh, we didn't give a message anymore. Rebecca, I'm really glad you're doing this for us because you've spoken for us before. You bring such energy and interest and expertise to these sessions. So thank you ever so much. And this Experts at Work webinar, as you know, is for members of all three of our networks. And today we're exploring 5 generations at work, how we win together for good, which is the title of this fabulous new book by Rebecca, which is just out. Which is excellent. Rebecca's a leading global expert and advisor on brand leadership and intergenerational collaboration. She has 20 years experience working with companies and organizations across the world, and you've appeared on the BBC, the FT, the Guardian, and the New York Times, as well as Experts at Work. So that's everything now, isn't it? And her third book, same title as I say, as the webinar is out. Rebecca, you're a trustee of the EY Foundation as well, a delegate of UN Women UK, and a companion of the Chartered Management Institute. And as I say, loved you having you speaking for us before. So this is going to be a really interesting session. Do let us have any questions or suggestions in the chat throughout. We're recording, as you know. We'll put the link on the YouTube channel afterwards, and along with Rebecca's slides. We probably won't have breakouts for this one, but Rebecca and I were just talking just before we started. We'll see how we go. But there's 3 great questions that Rebecca's got for the group, which we can reflect upon around about halfway through, something like that. So please put yourselves on mute for now if you haven't already. Rebecca, thanks again, and the floor is yours.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, as always, Richard, for the energizing introduction, which is fantastic. Hopefully everyone can see the slides okay. Is that working? Fantastic. Brilliant. Big thumbs up from Richard. And thanks so much for your time today. So this is 55,000 words with 5 years of plus of research behind it. So in the time that we have, I'm going to keep it punchy, high energy, high impact. There's a lot more inside. Broadly, the rule is whenever I get writing a book, a lot of people have said to me, Rebecca, I realize why you write books, which is to be part of the solution. And I genuinely mean that. I really do. So 80% of this book is all about the solutions, 20% of it really is about the insights and the research behind it. So I'll get started. As I said, we're going to open this out into the round table. So really energized and excited to hear your reflections. So the real context behind this, the clue is in the title. For the first time in history, we have 5 generations in the workplace. And of course, the reality is we have aging populations the world over. That's also an interesting point. There's a ton of data viz in the book around sort of what those population shape shifts look like from one region and country to the next. But broadly, we are entering this moment when we are aging. We are going to want and need to work for longer. So the whole notion of our generational diversity is on a lot of people's minds. However, and this is the big thing that I want to cut through, and it's a big motivation behind writing this book, is that we have seriously been having the wrong conversation about generations. When I say we, I don't mean any of us on this call. I mean the world at large. When we think of, and I'm sure we can reel off countless examples. There was a big recruiter, we shall not name them, only a few weeks ago coming out with something that was highly stereotyped about generations at work, the language and the framing that they use. But what I mean by this is every time we see a poll or a survey or a news article that is trying, on the one hand, to tell us that perhaps the younger generations are the laziest in history, which ostensibly is not true. And on the other hand, anyone over sort of 45, 50, they are being ignored, their careers are in decline. I mean, the whole thing is a complete mess, as you can imagine. And it's predicated on completely the wrong things. It's predicated on a lot of silos and stereotypes. And instead of this, actually, there is a phenomenal work going on in a lot of organizations that really is taking our generational diversity as an opportunity to unlock the greater potential we have in those 5 generations at work. So this was a part of the insight and the vision I had, and genuinely wanted to be part of the solution to say, it's 2024. We really don't have time, in the context of all the things that are raging in the world as well, and in context of all the pressures that we have around us in business every day, and ever more that's coming onto the HR plate, is it's time for us to actually to have a different conversation that's a lot more positive, collaborative, and productive. And I love this. This is a quote that I just wanted to pull out from. I'm a bit of a quote nerd, as Richard knows, but these quotes are very meaningful because they came from, every case study in the book is written in dialogue and in conversation with the different people that we talk to. Again, it's only a snapshot in the book. We spoke with hundreds of organizations, and that research goes back a long way, but we were very privileged to have access to a number of different businesses. This is the Pentland Group, whom I'm sure a lot of you will know and be familiar with. If not, not their brand. So they're the owners of a huge portfolio of brands across sport and lifestyle, everything from Speedo to LS and Berghaus, etc. But I love this. Brand relevance is about how we connect across generations. And for me, this starts to really reframe the conversation around the opportunity that we have, the reality that we have, and it moves us away from these silos and stereotypes. This is how we're doing business. This is the conversation that we're having at the boardroom level. And not that anyone on this call needs it, but I just thought I'd just throw this up very, very quickly in terms of what we mean by the generations. Of course, there are 6 here. Gen Alpha, obviously, not quite yet in the workplace, but everything from Gen Z, Millennial, Gen X, baby boomers up to Silence. Now, Silence pretty much take the form of, at that point, they're often in board roles, maybe patrons, sort of donors, other stakeholders. I mean, again, there are still a lot of Silence as founders or owners of businesses are very present and active in the business, but that's broadly what we're looking at. And of course, it is elongating and stretching as people are going to want and need to work for longer. Interestingly enough, side note as well, there's sort of lots of fun curios and anecdotes, but so you'll see the source here is Pew Research Centre. As I'm sure a lot of you know on the call, there is no single naming system or indeed definition for generations, which again, fascinating from a lot of respects. And of course, these are only the Western terms. So there's another discussion if anyone is interested in terms of the work that you may be doing in other markets, that gets us into some quite interesting context for generational naming and framing. But very briefly, if whistle-stop tour through the context and call to action, because I did really write this and in collaboration as well. And again, writing in collaboration is always edifying and stronger. But 6 years of research and work, 4 continents traveled, wanted to get to 7. The next one won't be too far behind this, so hopefully we'll get to all 7. Importantly, as I mentioned, the conversations and case studies, only a snapshot of which are in the book, were written in dialogue with 5 generations. So there's everything there from one or two, which actually span 5 generations from 18 to 80. We have everything across different aspects of business and society and education and different walks of life. And that was important as well, the context. Of course, there's a lot of business focused work in here. But I really wanted this to be a macrocosm of how we all operate in our organizations. And of course, as the challenges that we're all working on are more complex and interconnected than ever before, the thinking was, what can we all learn from each other, whether it's business, family business, the world of education, universities, government, and social purpose and innovation. So that's a whistle-stop tour through it. As ever, context is so important to this. And again, talking about how I want the book really to be part of the solution is when we think about this layering of the different generations, what's fascinating is how much work is going on to help solve for this. So you've got everything from work around longevity. So that's Linda Grattan, Andrew Scott et al., who have done a lot of work on the 100-year life, let's call it that, both literally and emblematically, right the way across to sort of Jonathan Haidt. His book came out just over the summer. I think we need to be a little bit careful about sort of adding more labels and to a very crowded world. Basically, Jonathan's, and again, this is a very positive move that he's making, trying to solve for younger gens and the context of mental health, set against obviously the rise of social media, technology, etc. What's interesting, I quote also Alex Mann at Channel 4, who's done a lot of work around Gen Z especially, and she says, actually, we're living in an age of overclassification. It's not helping any of us. So I think, again, when we are putting this work out in the world, I think it's really important that we're not adding to more of the sort of labels. So this is really looking at our organizations through lenses rather than labels. And so again, language is really important. Of course, Roman at the right hand of the spectrum, he's done a lot of good work over the years on future generations, which is also a little bit a nod to him and that important work of how we think about what will happen again in X decades time. So what we are doing today, how is that really contributing to the longer term solution? So that longer term picture was really important to us. And that's why the final chapter of the book is all about generations future. So that's a little bit of context in that regard. And then just thought that this might be interesting because, of course, everyone on the call is from different types of businesses, scale, sectors. So the broad breakdown pretty much, and these are just the case studies in the book alone. So this is not the wider context of it. So each chapter then is interspersed with living dialogue and case studies. But so it's big global businesses, from groups through to media organizations such as the FT, family businesses. And again, it was just, such a privilege in terms of, and I think it really was an indicator to us when organizations such as Mars opened their doors and speaking with three of the family members of Mars. As you all know, family businesses are very, very private. They don't often talk about the work that they're doing on the inside and how that's connecting to the sort of 5 generations at work. There's some amazing work that Mars are doing, really connecting their purpose and their principles to long-term solutions. Education and government was also important. So everything from the Oxford Character Project, really interesting work that's going on there, through to the EU, and then through to social purpose and innovation. And of course, education and social mobility runs through a lot of this work. It was really interesting, the red thread that were coming up. So you see the likes of EY Foundation, but also Mission 44, which is, if you haven't heard of it, that's the Lewis Hamilton's charity. Really big dedication to putting young people at the head of and the heart of the organization in a very real terms. So as we look at really the spectrum of what we're dealing with, this came through loud and clear in terms of our research, in terms of wider stats that are out there. And I just thought, for simplicity's sake today, I just put this in context. So obviously everything in green, good indicators, but by and large, I don't think there are very few organizations or employers, and I'm sure none of us on the call today would disagree with the fact that having a multi-generational workforce is key and essential to growth and success. The question is how we are able to unlock it. How do we have agency in our roles to unlock that to its full potential in our organizations? What's interesting is, and again, this is often due to constraint that is upon us in our respective roles, but quite an interesting gap in looking at this, sort of somewhere between the 6 to 10% around how confident we feel in organizations actually to maximize that multi-generational workforce. So there was a lot here around, this is a big thing around the leadership mindset and the mindset that we all have in our roles, to really take this forward and say, look, we do have 5 generations at work for the first time, or we're on the cusp of that. How do we better connect what we're seeing with our customers in terms of what we're able to do on the inside of our organization? So that, I think, is a really important point, and that's a helpful stat. Again, I'll happily share the slides, and if you want or need sort of more data viz behind it, of course, in the book, but I'm really happy to share that, because a lot of this is taking forward a bit of that business case to how we close that gap. And I was saying to Richard earlier on, what's really interesting in the book and the research, and as I say, that goes back over 5 years. That is across a ton of things. It's through qual, quant, AI powered research. The AI powered research was absolutely fantastic because, and by the way, I will actually add a very important disclaimer. None of the book itself was written by AI. I'm too much of a writer, a purist writer, to actually care about the writing. So none of it was written by AI, but AI was fantastic in pulsing questions into social discourse, so we could really get a sense of what is the sentiment, what is the motivation, what is the intent and real insight behind cross-generational conversations, and what is on different generations' minds. So that was fantastic. And of course, that pulsed throughout the time that we were writing the book. And really what it came down to, I don't have a generations problem. Of course, there are differences in terms of these 5 generations, and that difference is going to become more exacerbated as we have, more extended workforces at work. But there were really 3 common patterns, and bearing in mind that this work is across those 4 continents, so it's a pretty strong global picture. The first challenge is around understanding. So where organizations were having more conflict and challenges, was there enough understanding in terms of, one, like the overview of the demographics of their workforce and that workplace, and also crucially how that connected into the consumer experience. Second of all, understanding in terms of, do we really understand each other in in the right way, and do we and how do we facilitate that in our organizations? The second point, obviously, and it goes hand in hand with that, was communication, either lack thereof. So a lot of cases are, interestingly enough, sort of both a mix of over communication was interesting, but also under communication. Over communication, I'll give you one example. A lot of research came through in the book around so many cases where there's so much going on in some organizations that employees are feeling actually overwhelmed by how much is going on. It's more exacerbated when we think about Gen Z, especially sort of early careers or sort of people rising into the workplace for the first time. Those projects, and we couch it pretty much as, project and initiative overload or project and initiative fatigue. And those projects and initiatives are often fantastic per se. They're designed with very good intent, whether it's in the form of ERGs, committees, different platforms. But there was a consistent thread around sometimes just too much going on, and it's just not connecting. It's certainly not connecting across the entire organization. So that was another one of the many nuggets that came out. And really, the end result is, the question is whether then organizations are able both to maximize individual and collective potential in the organization. So they were the sort of three big insights that came out in terms of the research. And I thought this was, again, just keeping it snappy so we can get it into some conversation after going through a quick case study, which was, this is the OECD again. I just wanted to talk about how important this is in terms of the research that is going on that absolutely backs up what we saw in terms of our research. And of course, these are different subsets, but I think it shows that when we're optimizing and maximizing the workforce that we have, be it 4 generations, 5 generations, or even further, as of course we're going to live for longer. So there are so many benefits, and I think that's what's so powerful about what came out of the book around this notion of collaborative leadership connected to collective intelligence, the collective intelligence of our organization, of those 5 generations. Because when we are able to unlock it effectively, and again, bearing in mind that productivity, number one here, needs to be more about effectiveness than it does about actually efficiency. What this sort of 5 generations at work mindset is solving for is actually a lot of the challenges that we all have in our organization. So we see an uplift in increased productivity, how we're better able to attract, motivate and retain talent. And of course, that is becoming a real challenge when we think about, that workforce is more extended than we've ever had in our role. So we think about early career starters, the context they've just been through in the context of both COVID and in terms of the rise of social and one of the first digital inflection points, right? Like, of course, we're at another one now. Both through them to, I hear a lot from organizations around real concerns around older employees in the workplace and the next level of opportunity for them. So it's really interesting conversation about what we can do through knowledge transfer, through re-architecting roles around whether it's practice leads, business unit leads, unlocking subject matter expertise. There is so much potential that we have there. It's really untrue. But again, this is often getting overlooked in organizations. And of course, our roles and career pathways aren't getting ever more vertical and thinner and more linear. They're actually getting more diversified and looking more like sort of horizontals and zigzags as we progress. And so I could go on, but again, numerous proof points around this notion of how, when we are maximizing our multi-generational workforce, we are having an uptick on all these things. So one of the most exciting things for me, actually, when looking at organizational values, which is another thing that we did as part of those big 3 things that we just talked about: understanding, communicating, and then maximizing our individual and collective potential, was how are we able to build collaborative muscle across the organization? This came about because we also looked at different organizational values, and of course, probably for anyone on this call today, and I'd love to, perhaps we can dive into that. But one of the top 5 organizational values is collaboration. So it sits there in our annual reports. Hopefully it sits more on a wall. I'm sure it absolutely does for everyone on this call. But the challenge was there's a huge disconnect when we think about how are we able to solve for maximizing that individual and collective potential in our organizations. Well, part of that lies around better connecting sort of what we say in terms of collaboration as an organizational value with what we are doing. And that doing has to be on a daily and everyday basis. And I think that was what was so exciting about the case studies that we chose to feature in all the interviews and all the work that we did in the book for this time round, was that they are all succeeding very well in building collaborative and creative muscle in the everyday. It's not an easy thing to do. It requires, but however, it's equally not a hugely challenging thing to do, but it just requires, that bigger sense of buy-in from our leadership teams. It requires a slightly longer term mindset. A lot of this is thinking in 3 to 5 and plus year cycles. It doesn't mean to say that work is taking that long to materialize, but we have to take a longer term view in terms of what we're doing. And of course, the other thing with these organizations, going back to that point around what we heard around so many employees hitting this project and initiative fatigue. This is the result also of these organizations doing fewer things well and also sustaining it. So I wanted to share one example of many of the case studies in the book. I have deliberately not included the brand in question, but I'm just going to give a speed view of one of the case studies that I think is just a fantastic example of when we think about, well, how can we actually solve for building that collaborative and creative muscle in our organizations? And bearing in mind that everyone on the call today, we might be working in one market and multiple markets. We may have highly articulated organizations with different portfolios and business units. There's a range of complexity that we're all dealing with in different shapes and forms. And so this story, I love. One of the reasons because it was inspired by one individual, and actually that it is true, and that was part of how we sort of selected the case studies that are in the book. A lot of these examples were inspired by one individual. They didn't take actually a huge amount of time or monetary investment, but I love that sense of agency that one of us can actually change things quite considerably in an organization, and passing on that message, to everyone in our organizations. So this was inspired by one individual in the organization. The context at the time was she had been with the organization for about 4 years, doing really well, but she thought, well, I'm ambitious and I really want to sort of move on to my next role, and I'd love to stay in this organization. This organization is a large organization. It has over 75 verticals, individual brands in that group and portfolio. So you can imagine we've got a lot of structure here. And her lens was, we don't have enough horizontals and diagonals and zigzags going on. So where she was a bit stuck with her own career was, well, I've worked for this individual brand within this group for all these years. I don't really know enough around sort of where I could move next. And what was beautiful about this, and I love this so much, instead of solving the problem for herself or just for herself, she ended up solving a potential problem for the entire organization. And so what she said, look, I can't be the only one with this challenge. So she started to have a little bit of think around what she could do to solve this. And she came up with the idea for a platform for collaboration, creativity and innovation across the entire organization, because what she realized there weren't enough opportunities for people from different roles, business units, areas of expertise, different cultures to naturally, it's I guess that sort of Pixar effect that we all have known and loved over the years. But she wanted to really create that for the organization. And of course, all the benefits therefore come around greater productivity, knowledge transfer, internal mobility, reward, recognition, etc., etc. And how she went about it, I thought I'd just love to share that with you as well, because she went to a couple of people in the organization, one who headed up people and culture, another who headed up L&D, and between the three of them, they really sparred, and it happened quite quickly. Her proposal was endorsed, and it got off the ground. And so that 365 platform, which has ended up being the focus of it, really, the purpose of it is to get the entire organization energized around pitching for proposals that are very real within this company and this group, and designed to be part of sustainable solutions. So these are real challenges that the organization is faced with. And rather than setting up an innovation lab or platform on the side, the idea was, let's thread this through the entire organization, invite people to get involved. And it's been hugely successful. And of course, one of the benefits is it's bringing the employee and consumer experience closer in the process. So I'm happy to reveal who it is as we come into Q&A. One of the reasons I didn't, because we can often look at an organization and think, oh, that's easy for them. They are a highly wealthy and high performing business. But in this case, it's very true and it's very real that it was inspired by one individual and didn't take a lot of investment. So I love that story all the more for that reason behind it. So that's a whistle stop of going through just some nuggets and highlights in five generations at work. What I'm hearing from a lot of organizations that I'm talking with is actually there is no one solution. There are many, which was part of the reason for putting so many different solutions and context in the book. But just for food for thought in the time that we've got today, it would be wonderful to open out perhaps 3 questions that Richard and I thought might be really interesting to get everyone's lens on. Number one, what is one of the top 3 things that we are all solving for in our organization? So whether that's in terms of the 1-year plan, the 3-year plan, what is on your mind? It could be around your consumer base is changing, whether it's skewing younger perhaps, and you're looking to hardwire into that. It could be across the entire organization. It may be many different things, but these are real sort of, what are your business challenges? What are you being asked to do maybe that's new or more of? Second of all, in the context of the 5-generation workplace or your multi-gen workplace, what are the gaps and challenges, if any, that you see? You might be firing on all cylinders, but it might be interesting just to see what you're seeing, whether it's within the organization or indeed with at the customer level. And third, again, in the process, is there something that each of us is doing that we could all learn from? Because again, a lot of this is very context relevant, and there are solutions and there is great work happening everywhere. So I'll close out there, Richard, and open out to the room if that works.
Thank you ever so much, Rebecca. Thank you for taking us through that. I mean, the great overview and really interesting insights as well. The case studies sound great. So 3 great big questions as well. Love those. So essentially, what are the current biggest issues, the top 3 issues in your organization? Secondly, generation particularly, wasn't it? The second question was about the gaps and challenges in terms of generational difference. And then what was the third one, Rebecca?
Yes. The third one, is there something that we could all learn from each other in terms of what we're doing or seeing in our organization?
Yeah. And also any other questions for Rebecca, anything that you would like to hear more about or anything that we've missed? So thanks, Rebecca. Love to hear from you. So in the chat or just dip in. We seem to have lost the raising the hand symbol on Zoom. At least I can't see anyway. From Amy. Thank you. Fair enough. No worries, Amy. So yes, just dip in and we'll manage the conversation that way.
Hi Richard, it's Pip from Gentrack. Sorry, I just realised I haven't got my video. Hello. We're looking at doing this in Gentrack at the moment, actually. So we're looking at launching that. And we've got some intergenerational awareness campaigns going on. And one of the things that we're really keen is about how do you leverage the collective, kind of not the differences, but the similarities. So is there anything you can talk about on that? Because I think what we're trying to do is avoid the divide. So when you're talking about collaboration, so how do you harness then actually leveraging some of their collective strengths rather than focusing on some of the differences? I guess to sum up would be helpful, I guess, to thought-provoking for what we're going to be doing next.
I really love that. And again, that was part of also in terms of the case study that I was referencing there was actually sort of the LVMH group, which is a huge group, as we know, with hundreds of thousands. But that was also part of the motivation there around how can we harness the strengths. A couple of things. I think one is, and again, this came through consistently, is first of all, acknowledging and understanding and celebrating the difference. It's a lovely quote that I often play back. I don't think I've shared this one with you before, Richard, but it's Toni Morrison in her Nobel Prize acceptance speech. She talks about meaning that secures our human difference. And so I love your point there, Pip, around that's what it's really getting to. Of course, there is difference because we've all grown up with the context of generational context is about everything from society to culture to conflict to economic, and that runs true. So there's a consistency there. So I think first of all, just having that greater understanding and openness within our organization and seeing it as a huge positive. I learned as much from Gen Zers as I do from generations above me and in between, and it's absolutely fantastic. But I think that mindset definitely isn't there in all organizations. You're absolutely right. I love that you're doing this intergenerational work as well. And then second of all, figuring out sort of whatever is the right construct for you to facilitate that and bring that together. What was interesting about the LVMH example was that they use that, and some of these actually have been a bit of a platform to sort of say, okay, this is something real that we're putting into the organization. So that was an entrepreneurial platform, but the idea also was that it was a real solution and intended to be a halo effect across the organization to sort of really tie into both. This is relevant to our culture because we're a highly creative organization. So it was a big sort of message out to the business, and of course a signal in terms of employer branding. So I think any time when you've got a tangible platform that you can use, it could be literal, it could be metaphorical. Another example would be, Pip, unlocking our managers. You know, what I love about, and again, you know, you mentioned Richard, one of the reasons I've supported the Chartered Management Institute for years, and I'm sure a number of others belong to that organization, you know, and we've all heard the term accidental manager, but that is still very true in so many of our organizations when, you know, we're not even able sometimes to invest properly in managers because either budgets or cycles, whatever it is that isn't there. But I think this is a real moment where are our pivots, our catalysts and connectors in organizations? How can we upskill and unlock and also celebrate them in the process, which is really fantastic. So I think, you know, managers who also are often in those multi-generational positions. They're managing multi-generational teams. What I hear a lot as well, if that's helpful, around especially from younger generations going into managerial positions for the first time, you know, a lot of concern around sort of the implications of that, suddenly responsible for a mix of generations for the first time. But again, hugely positive results when there's greater intentionality around how we can see managers as a real part of the solution across the organization. So I'm a big believer in where can we look at horizontals, zigzags, and really thread more of that through the organization. I guess the final thing is, it might be helpful, is just all helps with the business case, because I think the times where, and you see this in even an organization the size of Mars, where they're again saying, actually, you know, we do fewer things well. We constantly interrogate why we're doing it. And that might mean actually we don't do 5 initiatives in the next few months, but we do sort of one thing really, really well, and we see it through. And I see that Pip also from all generations respond really well to say, it's much easier for me to get behind sort of, you know, fewer things, whether I'm actively involved in them or not. But I think that just really helps around, so that again, going back to that employee experience.
What do you think, Pip?
Yeah, great. That's really helpful. Thank you, because we're doing some modules and awareness campaigns starting at the end of this year on leadership kind of modules on this specific thing. So I think thinking about how do we facilitate that kind of link to tangible deliverables, I think is a way that we could facilitate some of that in those sessions. So yeah, that was really helpful. Thank you.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Also, kudos to you that you're doing leadership modules on education and awareness. Not everyone is, so that's fantastic.
Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, I missed that, Pip. Was it part of a leadership program?
So we work partner with the we use our apprenticeship levy for Chartered Management Institute, but we so we've level 3 and level 5 so that they get qualifications in that. But separate to that, we're looking at leadership learning days on a quarterly basis that will have modules on specific topics. So we did our first EDI survey in February, and we launch our EDI strategy globally tomorrow. And one of those things that came out of our EDI survey was around the fact that we've got a really multi-generational workforce. We're a technology, we're a software company, so we have the real end of the spectrum of Gen Zs and Boomers. So how do we leverage those skill sets, because we have a need for both? So that's one of the modules is around what are the strengths of both areas, what are the things that we should be mindful of, and the kind of experiences piece to Rebecca's point, but then what are the things that we can put behind that to drive the innovation. So for us, that was the thing that came out in our engagement survey, was around we haven't got as much innovation considering we're a software company as we want. So for us to leverage that, so that's where we're having these leadership offsites. We did one literally maybe 3 weeks ago, all around how do we navigate change. So we got an external speaker in to talk about, actually we're going in a year full of change, we're in a changing environment, how do you operate in that environment and pull together, because we work in a matrix, we split people up into very intentional groups across the matrix to then solve a collective problem. So similar sort of thing to what Rebecca's talking about. So it's good context to have that could work in that environment as well.
Yeah, definitely. Sounds like a case study for the 2nd edition, Rebecca. Good luck with it, Pip.
It is definitely, Pip. You need to be in the 2nd edition for sure.
Thank you both. Appreciate it.
So other thoughts, also the questions that Rebecca raised, what's your current challenges as a business? Top three priorities rather, beg your pardon, and then the generational challenges secondary to that. Love to hear it in the chat or just dip in.
And if it's helpful, Richard, I'm just, again, Pip, I just to build on your point, I think your point around learning development as part of the solution, I think is so important. It really is. Again, that's another red thread, isn't it, throughout the entire organization. Also heard in the research, actually, especially from younger gens in the workplace, or the people who need to, quote unquote, the people who need to be in the room are not always there. In terms of perhaps universal training and awareness and education across the organization. So I loved your point, because I think that what are the skills, that's why I go big around sort of what are the problems that we're solving for in our organizations, and what are the skills that we need to get there. And where there's a lot of technical skills that we won't have a lens on in terms of, I mean, that half-life is really getting quite short, isn't it? But certainly, in a more volatile world where things are more connected, agility, creativity, adaptability, these universal skills, I think finding ways that bond and bind us, or reinforce how we can be more sort of bonded and binded in a good way across an organization, is important. But just want to give a double click on what you were doing about leadership learning days. I think that is absolutely fantastic. I think the regularity is important, because that gives your leadership a real chance to actually say sort of we are doing this, talking about it, and then role modeling it, of course, which is the other thing, which I know sort of you don't have necessarily control over in a good way, but that's half the battle, because I hear that a lot, and that came through the research around where is the disconnect around learning for the few or learning just for younger gens in the organization. But that leadership learning days on a quarterly basis, I just think it's fantastic.
Is that when in the case studies that in the book, what was the sort of the most frequent hook, so to speak, that five generational work was hung on? Was it DEI? Was it projects? Or was it leadership development? Or was it something we've missed?
Oh, do you know, that's a really good question. Actually, it was honestly so much of it. It was the entire gamut. What was really interesting with the DEI perspective is actually, again, those the organizations that are really maximizing the 5gen workforce, where there was almost a sort of natural cascade of solving for other things. So let's just take companies who had set up next generation boards. I mean, that's one way in which we're able to facilitate. So the ask is, well, how can we better facilitate cross-generational dialogue? Next generation boards obviously exist in the form of youth advisory boards in social purpose and innovation. They have been known as shadow boards, which I think, again, probably a lot of us on this call don't agree is a very helpful term. When I don't think anyone should sit in the shadow of anyone or anything, but that's why sort of next generation boards, I think, have taken on a bit of life of their own. But that's a nice platform which really brings together younger gens in an organization closer to the leadership teams for much more sort of mutual dialogue, greater sort of mutuality. So I think mutuality was a big watchword that came up across all these things, Richard, around sort of how can we bring together the best of, whether it's 4 gens, 5 gens, at the heart of what we're solving for as an organization, but also crucially linked to our purpose and values. And I think Mars, interesting enough, mutuality is one of their 5 principles, and they have woven their 5 principles so deeply and so strongly into their total operating model. So to your point, it therefore shows up in how they do performance reviews, how they look at long-term business planning, how they invest in themselves, not only within the business, but that the family is very, we invest in ourselves from a generational perspective. So that constant sort of learning muscle, that collaborative muscle were big threads. And then, of course, what you see is, and going back to your point on DEI, that's having a good knock-on effect, because that's helping with our ability to attract, retain, motivate talent. It's helping with our ability. Let's take next generation boards. Every next generation board that we mapped, and there were hundreds across different organizations, the diversity of those boards was just hands down above and beyond what was on the leadership team or board of their organization. So when we're here in 2024 still trying to solve for gender representation on boards, let alone any other dimension of diversity, and we really haven't got there yet, these are great because they're really tangible examples of saying we can do this, we can make it happen. And the biggest part is actually how we're committing to it as an organization. And that's where that goes back to the project and initiative thing, is that where it goes wrong, Richard, is when it's seen as, oh, we're doing something because it's a project or initiative. So going back to Pip's examples, this is a constant red thread. There is continuity. People can see the from and to journey, or the to and from journey, and how that cascades. Does that answer some of?
It does. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. What's people's views on the call? Is this something you'd like to do? Is it something you're currently doing? Have people done next gen boards, for instance? Is it what you'd like to do if it's not something you've worked on yet? Do you see the 5 generations in the workplace not engaging with each other as much as you'd like, or is it something that's actually not a problem? Helen, thanks.
Richard, apologies, I can't get my camera on. New job, new computer, and I can't. Zoom's obviously not a system, so apologies. This is a fascinating topic, and I'm just going to share some thoughts. Really, I've just joined a new organisation, so I'd come from Arup, a very multi-generational organisation, and we were trying to put in kind of next generation boards there. Hadn't quite made some of that progress, but where we had snippets of doing it, we were really seeing the value of it, particularly I think, as to your point, Rebecca, around innovation. So there's a sense of, an organization with people from, new big cohort of new graduates coming in every year, to actually retaining people well into their kind of 70s, because actually their love of the organization and their discipline was just so I think there we were kind of scratching at the surface of it. There was real appetite, I think, probably from the younger generations coming in, but there was much more work to do with the senior leadership on how to do that in an effective way. But I could really see that. On the contrary, I've just joined an organization that is incredibly young. And actually, I'm probably noticing, I'm not even sure as a HR professional I should use that word, should I? I asked yesterday, the average age is 31. So an organisation of consultants who join our organisation from university have got really big growth plans. And honestly, I don't think we've probably got enough experience in terms of driving the energy. So a really different challenge. And as I'm listening to all of this, I'm wondering, how do you really navigate the kind of, the Arups have got the 20 to the 75, and how do you bring real multi-generations to actually a very young workforce with huge ambitions, and actually their only experience is in this organization, and very few kind of people at the top of the organization who have also grown up there. So actually, how do you bring the outside in? So we're going through some transformation. They're bringing in kind of lots of new people into probably some more of the corporate services functions in order to drive some of that. But you can really see the energy, but you can see some inexperience. And how do you therefore kind of drive the experience in that you don't want to feel that just comes out of time, but how do you drive that? I don't have the answer. I'm in week 3, but I'm noticing it's a very different challenge to what I was facing in Arup. So if anybody's got any thoughts.
That's such an interesting context, Helen. And I think just touching on your sort of from and to journey is really interesting, as you say, because that what you articulated at Arup really resonates around, the appetite is invariably there in terms of both ends of the spectrum, to your point, the younger gen, but also leadership. The challenge is I hear a lot, and again, evidence in the book as well, was that sense of, buy-in from the stakeholders that you need at the time. And I think that is partly because one, there's that sense of it risking being, I think, sort of a bit tokenistic. So it's a sense of, so I've always said, again, with companies I'm working with, just don't do it. If you're at that point where you just think it's going to risk. I think the second thing is also because these are longer term things, and invariably this should have, a shelf life of at least a good few years where you can take it through cohorts, and that's what's beautiful about next generation boards. So you typically rotating every sort of 12 months, and so you're building, sort of community and real peer networks, especially within global organizations and people from different disciplines. So that I absolutely resonates. Interestingly enough, where that's broken through, and again, there are some examples in the book, is actually where the business case was co-created with different genders in the organization. So it became, such a groundswell from across the organization, and so many that actually it got through. But I think in terms of your other point, I so empathize with you on this in a good way, because you're right, high performing, coming from probably sort of a mix of top backgrounds from different walks of life, and how do you keep that motivation? And I think you're right, because where are them role models necessarily in the organization if you haven't got that sort of diversity? I love what you said about bringing the outside in, because I think that's interesting from a sort of what does the sort of culture of learning look like, and how could that maybe be part of it, and in terms of keeping people inspired. How is the organization connected to different things that you get involved with from both the customer perspective, but also I'm just thinking with other partners and stakeholders. And I think giving people that sense of agency and responsibility, because you're absolutely right. I think there's also signs and signals around where inexperience exists, and how do you better connect that with other areas of expertise in the organization. So where you can do it cross-generationally, I think that's fantastic, because it's that sense of mutual learning and learning from each other. But I think certainly, I think this current stat is, what is it, something like we're going to have 7 careers and 20 jobs. So what does loyalty really need to look like in your organization? How are you looking to grow people on? And I think having really honest conversations with people around career pathways, what does that look like? And it's surprising actually how many organizations are not as enlightened as I can just hear your energy and your voice, and the sense of that we've got very strong, very rigid structures still, where it's still supporting linear, very vertical, thinner career paths, which don't really exist anymore. So it sounds like you're in a platform where there is greater plurality, I guess, not only in terms of the shape of your organization, but I think the more that we can foster that sense of plurality connected to the purpose, I think is that there's something really exciting there, and getting people involved also in just meaningful agendas that they can obviously celebrate on CVs and LinkedIn and all their different performance reviews. I think the final piece is, and I don't know how easy this is in the organization that you're in, I think just metrics are both our foe and our friend, depending upon what's happening in our organization, the constraints that are put upon us. So much research in the book around the wrong metrics, and partly that is driven by, depending upon whether we've got public listed companies. Again, with your organization, you might have a bit more sort of liberty there, but I think that sense of what we measure and why, and allowing that to liberate us a bit more in the process. I've always banged on for years about the need for more collaborative metrics, and there's a beautiful red thread again throughout all the work in the book, which is some of that we just can't measure, and that's a really, really good thing. There's a beautiful quote from one of the St. Gallen leaders of tomorrow, and she says it's all about being, the sum being greater than the individual parts. And I think getting that mindset into everyone in the organization will help a lot, which is why I go back to that. The more that we can coach and engage through a collaborative mindset, we're really able to unlock that that collective intelligence. So, but it sounds like you've got an opportunity filled with a lot of high potential people. It's just a question of perhaps unlocking a few of these things to harness it in the right direction. But I think going back to that, agency meets responsibility meets accountability, and in ways that it gets celebrated through the organization is a bit of a common pattern in a good way.
Thank you. Super helpful.
Do you use
Really
external
nice
mentors?
Thanks for the great question. Really interesting.
Helen, do you use external mentors already?
Not really. No, not that I've unpicked so far. And I think to your point there, yeah, most of the graduates are coming from Oxford. To do top, we're driving very high performance, quite an up and out type culture. And so also I think that vulnerability to acknowledge, because actually you've always been the top of the pack, it is quite an interesting perspective. The point I think at the kind of the other end is actually when you don't have a huge amount of people, when the hierarchy is also then quite flat, there's not actually huge amounts of people. So I think to your point, Richard, perhaps looking at outside in to kind of help and support some of those people's development could be an option. And I absolutely take your point around this kind of collective reward, because actually the big philosophy of the company that I'm at now is about team And they use quite a lot of analogies to sport. Have we got our best players on the pitch, and are we delivering the absolutely best thing for the client? So actually, it's not about individual; it's about absolute high performing teams that deliver. And therefore, I think then you've got the interesting question about, do the reward strategies then align to that, and are they driving the behavior that you think? The metrics, I think, is a very, very hard. That you keep constantly hear, don't you, in the organizations, what gets measured gets done, and it's like, I'm not sure. We seem to talk a lot about revenue and client satisfaction and not enough about the people stuff. Feels like attrition, and I'm like, I don't know. So maybe that's a topic for future.
I think that's something you just sparked a really, really, again, another consistent thread through the book, Helen. I love that about what you said about language. I mean, already the language you're using, I mean, that strikes me as you're in, clearly, I mean, you wouldn't have moved so otherwise, right? But it's clearly a good company, and perhaps you're already doing some of this in your first weeks. But clearly they're at least aligning the language to sort of shared value, collective value. I think where the warning signs are is if suddenly, sort of performance reviews are all about sort of, go into defaults, and then there are exceptions if there's toxic behavior. I mean, that's where sort of I get really, we all get a bit frustrated about the metrics, because that doesn't really hold true. But another thing was on my mind, I think, again, to your point, because you're dealing with that sort of type A, high performing, everyone is coming from sort of, deep achievement and deep knowledge. The other thing that's on my mind there, in terms of how you foster the sort of, the quieter and louder voices along that spectrum, because that's, and that sort of bonding and binding. And I think something I've done in the past that just if that's helpful, is just indexing on everyone's super skills, because there's obviously the role and there's the title, but sort of, who is the person behind? I mean, I remember when I've done those kind of exercises in different ways before, and you suddenly learn, somebody has got, a whole host of skills. They're perhaps running a charity on the side, or it may be a creative outlet that they have. But I think that is really fantastic, because it casts people in different lights beyond their job title, and then hopefully often I have a big thing about what happens with the quieter voices in the room if we don't have strong cultures. So it sounds like you've got a very strong culture, but that just could be interesting around super skill sessions, and the great way of just people learning about each other in the process.
Great, thank you.
That's a really nice point, Rebecca. I like that, especially with in Helen's team, in Helen's context specifically, because it's team orientated, it would fit. Please do come in with the last. We've got 2 more minutes for time for another question. Please do come in if you have one. If you don't, I'm just going to ask Rebecca until you do. What do you think, when you were looking at the case studies, was there ever an element in which it felt a bit forced in terms of the intergenerational things they were doing? Did they manage that? So did it feel in any sense, how can I put this? We're trying to get people from a certain age bracket. It might be a bit awkward. Is there any that sort of feeling up to it that they've managed? And if so, how did they manage that? I suppose we really
that's a really great question. I think purposefully the case studies that we chose were deliberately because it wasn't forced. I think that's really important. And also those case studies represent a body of work that some of that has been in place for a long time in very established organizations. In some cases, for example, it's Lewis Hamilton's charity Mission 44 only set up just a few years ago. So those were a few of the criteria around sort of what got chosen for this time around. But I think you raise a really interesting point around forced, is that the big message behind the book is align this with the business strategy. And I think, again, it's been really, the light bulb moments have gone on in front of CEOs and C-suites, especially when you say, look, this isn't another thing that we need to think about. Actually, if we just think in this in this mindset, which is a maximizing mindset of a reality that we are only going to enter ever more aging populations, we're going to need to work for longer. That's only going in one direction, with so much work around longevity, that if we're not hardwiring for this now, we're going to be sort of caught unawares if we're not. So it felt actually, I think the words I would use, one, very intentional. I think there's a shift from, I guess I talk about a shift from attention to intention. I think attention being about this, just so much going on in organizations. And I think, where everyone in our roles on this call, it's about denoising the organization. And I think the more that we can do that. So those case studies were examples of actually, there was enough space and bandwidth in the organization to do this, because I think they'd had healthy conversations around sort of the right timing, to some of your points, Helen, also just around sort of, how you make that business case for the Arup thing, who you get involved along the way. And also, I think that sense of just communicating, going back to those principles, communicating and celebrating across the organization. Of course, it has to come full circle, because I think that showing that connectivity between individual and collective potential and making that a everyday part of your organization. I think that's probably the, one of the final, really big shout outs, is that a lot of this work is in the everyday. And again, that doesn't mean to say that we are sort of, pouring more and more into the everyday. Again, it's setting up, one platform, for example, that can suddenly, over time, we're seeing over, 18 months, fantastic, that is having a positive effect on the entire organization, because it's bringing us together in new ways. So a lot of this is just how we get closer as an organization, which doesn't mean necessarily sort of huge, outpouring of personal stories, but it's just that sense of whatever barriers and conflicts. A lot of it is down to, as I go back to that big point, I think one of our big asks is, let's just stop reacting to all that that hype cycle in the media, which is not helping anyone. It's helping to sell a lot of things out there and having some commercial benefit, but it's not helping any of us in our organizations, when really at the heart, we are there to connect the employee experience, the consumer experience. And I think if we also couch it in that way to our CFOs and our CEOs, that's where we're getting a lot of this work through. And that's also true of all the case studies in the book, which is why I share Leticia's story in that mini case study earlier on. That's one inspiring individual who decided to solve a problem for many in the organization, got the support of people like us in our different roles, and was able to see it through.
Great answer. What a thorough answer. That was a brilliant answer. Thanks, Rebecca. Love that. It's all about bringing the organization closer together. That's a great note to end on. Thanks to everyone for coming. Rebecca, thank you so much for taking us through that. We'll send the link out with the book and the slides. Thanks, Rebecca. And we'll see you again soon. Thanks, Rebecca.
Oh, thank you so much, Richard, as ever. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.